Welcome, everybody, to this episode of Global Wellness Conversations, the official podcast of the Global Wellness Summit. And I'm here with a really, really cool guest today, Bill Hayes. He's intimidating because, he's the author of 7 books. We're going to talk about one of them and sneak in some others, but he's also the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship in nonfiction. He also writes for the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Buzzfeed, The Guardian, and how in the heck does he have the nerve to be a published photographer? But he does. And he has a book that I can't wait to talk about at the end of our story. But first off, we're going to focus on his book that came out in January 2020 called Sweat, A History of Exercise. Bill, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
All right. Well, we have so many questions for you, but let's just set the stage for our listeners who might not have heard your other interviews. Right. Why did you decide to do this book and how long did it take you?
Well, I've always loved to exercise and work out. And it was quite a while ago, 10 or 12 years ago, I was in a gym and I'd gotten onto the Stairmaster, which is my sort of cardio machine of choice, the old school cardio machine, and punched in my program. I still remember it was fat burner, level 15, 25 minutes, put down my towel.
Don't say 15. I do level 7 on fat burner. Thank you. Okay, go ahead.
Put down my water and towel. And for some reason on that particular day, I looked out at the gym floor, all these people, men and women of all different sizes and ages, and doing push-ups and pull-ups and bench presses and curls and yoga. And I just thought to myself, how did we all end up here? How do we all end up in gyms? And if I were to trace a line backward in time, where would I land? When did it start? And I actually got off the Stairmaster, left the gym, and went to the public library. Really just thinking there's got to be a book on the history of exercise. I was just curious for an answer to that question. And there wasn't one. And a light bulb did go on, I guess that's the phrase, where I thought, that could be a really interesting subject for a book. Yeah. And but it took some years to sort of develop and think about. And I, meanwhile, worked on some other work and moved to New York City from San Francisco, bought a camera, became a street photographer, but all the while kept working out and thinking about this question: when did the history of exercise begin? And in 2013, I won a Guggenheim Foundation fellowship and used that to really do the foundational research for this book, and traveled throughout Europe and India and the United States. And some years later, we have Sweat.
Sweat.
Yes.
And let me tell you something. Part of your book is, the parts where you're traveling and researching and going to these enormous major libraries and walking down long hallways. The time that you met that translator of the Latin text, it was like a spy novel. I have a black hat, a fedora, glasses. That was so cool. But
I thought it'd be fun to include those parts of the journey. Writing this book was quite a journey over 2 millennia, from the beginnings of exercise in ancient Greece and Rome up to the present day, including the pandemic. But then I, as an author, as a writer, went on my own journey doing research for this book. So the book weaves together the history of exercise with my own journey in writing the book and my own personal history of exercise as I try out just about every form of exercise there is, sometimes terribly.
Yeah, let me tell you, one of my favorite things about the book is how you do inject your own personal story. It's sort of like a podcast to us. I'm always yammering on about my life, but it is so cool. Whether you're writing about, even in your writing that isn't about exercise, the history of buildings in New York City or why Greek men exercise in the nude, there comes your story. But my favorite was when you tested out why the Greeks exercised naked. That was so great that you're jogging up and down your country house driveway in your birthday suit. That was so cool.
Well, again, it was sort of just looking for the answer to that question. I knew that the very word gymnastics means literally translated exercising in the nude. Mm-hmm. And we've also sort of come to accept these images of Greek and Roman athletes at the Olympics and other athletic games exercising naked, and go to the Met Museum or other national museums and you see athletes wrestling, boxing, running nude. And I just one day thought, did that really happen? Did they really do that?
Or was that just art?
Yeah. And if so, what was that like? So yeah, one day when I knew I had privacy at my late partner's country house,
Right.
He had a long driveway about a quarter mile long.
Yeah.
So I just shucked my shorts and shirt and tried it out, and it worked.
Well, that is called dedication to your craft, Bill. And I so appreciate it. But now, I was listening to your book on Audible, and I was tickled to see that you voiced your own book. Was that the first time you've done that, or how's that?
That was the first time. Sweat is my 7th book, and others have been done for Audible or audiobooks. And I had an opportunity to try it this time. And I gained so much respect for those narrators who do it. Oh my gosh.
Oh my gosh.
It was way harder than I ever expected. It was a great challenge. You're basically in a broom closet-sized recording studio with a very good microphone and a director on headphones and a sound engineer outside. And you read your own book. And whereas at a reading, let's say, if you stumbled over a word, it wouldn't be a big deal. When
Right.
You're recording an audiobook, it's got to be word for word exactly as it is in the book, of course. So you just have to do it over and over again until you get it right. But the other great thing about it, really, the great experience about it as a writer is you really have to commit to your writing and commit to your words. And fortunately, I can say fortunately, when I finished the marathon sessions of reading my entire book, I was really happy with it. I was really happy.
Oh, so I've always wondered how
finish.
long you go at a chunk of reading. How long would you go?
We did 3 8-hour days.
What?
Actually, it wasn't in a row. Two days in a row, and then a day off, and then a third day. And then I came back maybe 2 or 3 weeks later and just cleaned up a few parts that needed to be cleaned up. But by the end of the third session, I was definitely very hoarse.
So tell me what you did to keep your throat healthy. I'm asking you this as a friend.
I did have cough drops, lots of water.
Good.
And it was a great experience. But I did gain tremendous respect for those narrators and professional narrators who do audiobooks.
And I feel like it was so good because your heart is so in it. It isn't someone acting. It's what you lived. So thank you for going through that, because I really think it helped. Yeah.
Sure. Well, there's a lot of memoir in Sweat. And so it made sense in that way as well. I've written other books that are pure memoir, no history. So I don't know. I think it injects a kind of personal quality into the audiobook as well.
I really do too. And I loved how every chapter, or nearly every chapter, started with a quote from an ancient philosopher or expert like Hippocrates. I mean, there is one from Tennessee Williams, but don't forget. I mean, that's good too. But when you think about the history of movement, and that the Greeks and the Romans believed that, movement was health, and that public gymnasiums were social gathering places. Also, when you stop thinking about it, the Olympics did start in Greece over 3 millennia ago. Does it make you think that everything old is new again? Does that make...
It's so true. I mean, there were so many surprises in doing research for this book. So just the very fact which you just mentioned, there were gymnasia in nearly every town in ancient Greece and ancient Rome, something I just wouldn't have thought of. So that day when I was up on the Stairmaster wondering, how did we all end up here? When did this all begin? Yes, not only were there gyms in nearly every town, there was a hierarchy of the employees at the gym. There was a gym manager. There were towel boys, the ancient equivalent of towel boys. But one thing I should make very clear, a big difference between ancient gyms and those today is that they were for men and boys alone. Women and girls were not allowed. And we'll probably get into this, but one of the frustrations maybe in doing research for the book was just finding those pockets of history when women and girls were not only allowed, but encouraged to exercise. And it took centuries and centuries. There is one exception, which I should mention, and that was the Greek sort of military state called Sparta. And Sparta, back as far as I think the 10th century BC, not only allowed but encouraged women and girls to exercise alongside men. Sparta was really devoted to warfare. And so it was really not exercise in terms of fitness like we think of it today, but really as training for war, fitness for hand-to-hand combat, or in many cases for women to be fit, so fit that they would bear healthy warrior male children.
Got it. Well, let's think about Wonder Woman. That was the island of female warriors. But isn't it true? I mean, I almost threw up when I realized this was in your book. It wasn't until the advent of the bicycle that women were encouraged. Is that right?
Well, that's close to right. It's really not until the 19th century, with the rise of the women's rights movements and suffragette movements, that women are really not only allowed, but really encouraged to exercise. And there's some amazing pioneers. But that did intersect, amazingly enough, with the invention of the bicycle, which was fascinating to me. You know, we sort of take bicycles for granted.
Yeah.
It took a surprisingly long time to perfect the design of a bicycle. It started out early in the 19th century. I believe it was in France. I might have that wrong. The most primitive early bicycles were meant to be substitutes or replacements for horses, because there was an absence of enough horses. So it was a very primitive machine. There were no pedals per se. You transported it or moved it forward just with your feet, almost like a scooter. And then there came versions of the bicycle that had gigantic front wheels and small back wheels.
I remember.
And practically needed a ladder to get up on top.
Yeah.
And finally, in the late 19th century, something very close to the kinds of bicycles we have today was invented. And some brilliant person, and I want to believe, I'm sure it was a woman, had the brilliant idea to remove the horizontal bar between the handlebars and the seat, so that women, just like men, could get onto a bicycle, in their case, so that their skirts or dresses didn't get caught in the pedals. And these were called ladies' safety bicycles. And it really did intersect with the women's rights movement. And one of my very favorite quotes in the book is by Susan B. Anthony, the great women's rights activist and suffragette. And she said, the bicycle has done more for the emancipation of women than anything else in the world. I stand and rejoice every time I see a woman ride by on a wheel, the picture of free, untrammeled womanhood.
Jeez.
I just love that.
It's so gorgeous. And let me ask, what did the Greeks and Romans have against women working out? What was it that they're too fragile or something?
Well, it was part of that whole culture, you know, that men and boys were the athletes and the warriors. And really the origins of exercise and fitness training goes back further to training for war. Mm-hmm. So it emerges out of that. And then with the founding of not only the Olympic Games, but other athletic games around 8000 BC, that was very much part of ancient Greek culture and ancient Roman culture. And only men were allowed to compete, but it did sort of trickle down to the masses with, just like today, like boys and young men wanting to emulate professional athletes, have bodies like them, run as fast as them, whatever it may be. A whole culture of exercise sprung up. In that time, the body was worshipped and athletic competition was popular and athletes were idealized. Right. So it was very much part of that culture. And one thing that was so fascinating for me to trace, which I hadn't really thought about, certainly didn't know about, was not only this rise of athletic competition in antiquity, but the decline with the rise of Christianity. And I'm really talking about the West here. So in the 2nd century AD, gladiatorial games are banned, and then the Olympics themselves are banned, and all athletic competitions are banned. And cathedrals began to replace gymnasiums as places of worship. And the focus shifted from idealizing the body to the soul, the spirit. And in fact, it became something more, more shameful and self-indulgent, let's say, to be exercising. The focus should really be on the soul, the spirit. And that went on
I read that they even said the spirit can flourish more in an infirm and weakly body.
Right.
But I couldn't get it straight in trying to listen. It sounds like, was it from the 9th century to the 18th century that exercise was thought of as pagan and unchristian? Is that how long it went?
It went for a long, long time in the West. Yeah, you have to remember that the ancient athletic games were dedicated to the Greek and Roman gods, and there was a whole pantheon of gods, and involved often blood sacrifices of animals. So there was a whole, to Christians at least, pagan aspect to those athletic games. And so that's what athletic competition and even exercise itself got associated with. And there's some long periods in history where there's very little focus on exercise and athletics. It's not to say people didn't dance or move or go for walks or things like that, but there wasn't that same idealization, that same celebration of the body and of movement and of exercise.
Well, now, to be fair, I just thought I would interject that the Apostle Paul wrote, and it must have been in around 50 of our common era. He said, bodily training is beneficial for a little, but godly devotion is beneficial for all things because it holds promise for the future, for now and for the future. But the point is, he said a little, he wasn't like against it totally, but it then got twisted because that wasn't the 9th century. That was the first, what would you call the 1st century, right? So it got twisted. But now we see that I think I read where you said YMCA's, it went so far, the pendulum swung that it went from no exercise to the Young Men's Christian Association and spiritual muscularity. Is that right?
Yeah, there's a whole movement called spiritual muscularity. And the pendulum swung the opposite direction. That comes with other changes in the culture. With the rise of the Industrial Revolution, for example. Yeah. There was a real fear, a real concern that, to put it simplistically, as people moved from the farm to the factory, that people, both men and women alike, were becoming too sedentary. And so there was a new movement in the 19th century, late 18th century, 19th century, to get people moving, to be less sedentary. And a whole movement called the physical culture movement, which was global. And it gave rise to different forms of exercise and the possibility for women and girls to exercise as well. And that intersected with religious movements and nationalistic movements. There was a lot of moving parts to keep track of. One thing I should mention, because we were talking about this big gap in history, one of the most surprising and fun parts of my research was discovering a book from the Renaissance, published in 1569.
Unbelievable.
It's considered the first comprehensive book on exercise, and written by an Italian physician named.
Can I say the name?
Yes, try.
Mercuriali. Mercuriali.
Excellent.
I wrote it phonetically because I was like, no, I will never be able to say this.
Yes, Mercuriali. He was a personal physician to a cardinal in Rome, a very prominent and also very wealthy cardinal named Alessandro Farnese. And Farnese, as it turns out, was fairly young, as far as I could tell, fairly healthy. So maybe didn't need a personal physician 24 hours a day. And Mercuriali had access to the Farnese family's private library, as well as the Vatican Library, and an interest in the human body as a doctor. And he began digging up, translating and deciphering these ancient Greek and Roman texts by philosophers and physicians like Hippocrates and Plato and Galen, and reading what they had to say about the human body and health and exercise. And so he wrote this book, D'Arte Gymnastica, which I would not have known about had it not been for a great librarian here in New York City. It was written in medieval Latin and illustrated with amazing illustrations. And that started me on a journey, you go on through the book, of my trying to sort of retrace Mercuriali's footsteps. What brought him to write this book? How did he write this book? there are chapters devoted to nearly every form of exercise known at that time. So walking, running, swimming, boxing, wrestling. Not included are things like bicycling, because the bicycle had not yet been invented. But I tracked down an English translation of his book and followed that journey as well.
Well, I love that you mentioned the gorgeous illustrations. And I think I sent a note to you that each year the Global Wellness Summit predicts wellness trends. And one of them they predicted recently was toxic masculinity and how social media has such influence on, having the six pack and whatever, are you good enough? And even men suffer the way women do with body imaging. Right. Did you think it was a problem way back then too? Could you guess?
Absolutely. I mean, I think obviously they wouldn't have had that same phrase, but there was a real sense of toxic masculinity in the ancient Greek athletic games, the idealization of the male form, taken to such an extreme that, to my surprise, sweat itself was considered a prize commodity. The sweat of men, the sweat of great athletes. And they even invented an instrument called the strigil to scrape the sweat and oil off these very hunky athletic men and funnel it into little clay pots. And I'm sure it was very funky smelling, and they sold it at gymnasiums. They sold this sweat and oil. It was called gloios, and they sold it for supposedly medicinal purposes. So there was a real idealization of the body and the athlete.
Well, which brings us to the next question. I mean, you picked such a great name for your book, but how most people get the role of sweat wrong, even today. Can you defend poor sweat for us, Bill?
Sweat, well, we'd not be alive if we didn't sweat. Sweat is necessary to just being alive, to living. Its primary role is thermoregulation. Mm-hmm. It's a very simple, ingenious form of air conditioning. So sweat comes to the surface of the skin. It's cooled off with the wind and the air, and it keeps the body temperature normal. And that is the primary function of sweat. There are other sort of associated roles with pheromones and odor and so forth, but so many people think that the main function of sweat is to sort of detox the body, to rid the body of toxic materials, but really that job is done by other organs like the kidney and the liver. We are born with millions of pores to sweat through and have those throughout our lives.
And if you guys think you don't need to buy this book, you better, because you're going to find out molecularly how sweat works. It's like crazy. But, before we go any further, we must get back to the Global Wellness Summit's research. 2019 was when we launched this podcast in Singapore. And that is the year they came out with their study called Move to Be Well. And it focused on, the Institute and the Summit are famous for first identifying the global wellness economy. And they break it into 11 sectors. Well, believe it or not, fitness is the third largest sector. Yeah. And I'll just break down the 6 sections, they say. And we know they're all true. Sports and active recreation, fitness in gyms like the Greeks and Romans, mindful movement, equipment and supplies, apparel and footwear, which I participate in every week, and fitness technology. But, the bad news was that, fitness had dropped off, gyms closed, during the pandemic and all that.
Right.
But they predicted that from 2020 to 2025, the market will nearly double in size from 738 billion to 1.2 trillion from their research. Wow. So Move to Be Well. Tell me how movement played a role in these early civilizations. How did you see dance fitting in, for instance?
Yeah. Well, this is a little bit tangential, but one question I often get asked is from people who don't like to exercise, who maybe dread exercise and are looking for some motivation. And one thing that I like to tell people is the word exercise itself has sort of a bad reputation. So
Yep.
think of movement as a synonym for exercise. Just think of it as movement. It's not necessarily exercise that has to take place in a gym. And if you just think of it as movement of any kind, you can credit yourself. You can pat yourself on the back for getting some exercise. If you get off your bus 2 or 3 stops early, or your subway stop 2 or 3 stops early, and walk the rest of the way home, don't think of it as just transportation on your 2 legs, but as getting some exercise because you're moving. That's the most important thing. But absolutely, the ancient Greek and Roman philosophers and physicians like Hippocrates, even though they did not have an accurate scientific understanding of how the body works or why exactly scientifically exercise is good for you, they had an intuitive understanding. There's a wonderful quote from Hippocrates from the 5th century BC. He actually published 2 treatises on exercise and healthy living, on wellness. Really, wellness is the word.
Yep.
And one of his quotes is, "Eating alone will not keep a man well." Let's say a man or a woman. "Eating alone will not keep a man or a woman well. He or she must also take exercise. For food and exercise, while possessing opposite qualities, yet work together to produce health." So there was an intuitive understanding that just movement of any kind, and they defined exercise as getting the heart racing, working up a little sweat was really all you needed to do. They didn't make recommendations like we might today of 30 minutes per day of exercise, but they definitely did encourage movement of any kind.
Well, I'll never forget also, I think it was an article you wrote, an excerpt from your book, that they didn't really categorize the specific or research benefits of exercise until the 50s. Some guy researched people that worked on a trolley line and the drivers were fat and lumpy and had more heart problems, but the guys that jumped up and down and walked up the steps were so much better off.
Yeah.
I mean, the 50s.
I know. You just summarized that study so well. That was great. You did. It would have taken me so much longer. There was this intuitive understanding going back to antiquity, and we already talked about the 19th century and the Renaissance. But what you and I are talking about is true scientific research or scientific studies that proved the health benefits of movement. And in that case, it was very ingenious. An epidemiologist in England named Jeremy Morris had this ingenious idea to compare the health and the mortality and the morbidity of drivers versus the conductors who got off and on the double-decker buses, and studied them, I think, over a full year, and found that those who had to hop off and on the bus and up and down the stairs of the double-decker buses were healthier and had a much lower mortality rate than those who just drove the buses. And then he replicated that study using post office workers or mail delivery people, and found that those who delivered the mail by foot were far healthier and had far lower mortality than the post office workers who sat at desks and didn't get that kind of daily movement. And he published his studies in The Lancet, a very respected British medical journal, in the 1950s. And that's really considered the foundation of what we now call exercise science and fitness and wellness and mindful movement. That's really where it begins scientifically.
Well, that brings us back now to the Global Wellness Summit trends. And I really wanted in your book, you tried so many things, Bill. Seriously, you're making me sick. You're trying the boxing. I think you tried fencing. I know we all love swimming. Right. And I loved what you wrote about walking and that you think it's so simple. But what was it you said? Think of it as efforts to prevent series of falls, the way we can stand upright and not fall over.
Yeah.
I mean, it's delightful to find out, right?
You just don't think about those things. It's as much about your body and your musculature and your bones keeping you standing, keeping you from falling, as it is keeping you moving forward. I did one of my early books is called The Anatomist. And in that book, similar to Sweat, it's a mix of history and memoir. I looked at the 19th century text Gray's Anatomy.
Oh, right.
And I tell the story behind this famous book, Gray's Anatomy, written by Henry Gray in 1857.
Not the hit TV show. Let's make our listeners know that. Okay, yes.
And for that book, I studied anatomy right alongside first-year med students at UCSF in San Francisco, and went from never having seen a cadaver to, by the end of the year, doing full cadaver dissection alongside the med students, and basically learning what Henry Gray had done 150 years before. And it was it was an incredible experience. Really grateful for it, that they allowed me to essentially audit the course.
Yeah.
But I learned so much about the human body and musculature. And so that also kind of informs sweat.
Right.
I try, when I'm writing about different forms of exercise, to very simply explain what's happening with the neuromuscular system and the cardiovascular system. So I kind of dissect the anatomy of a push-up or of yoga moves from the inside out.
Can you remember Shakespeare's quote about swimming? It was so sexy. What was it? Something about the sinewy, join me in the waters, because it is beautiful when you watch a good swimmer, or how you can tell if someone swims. You look at their body and you can tell, right?
Guess what I did right before this conversation with you? Honest to God, and it wasn't planned.
You swam at the Y or something?
I swam a mile at my pool.
Who are you? I don't even. Okay.
It was great though. It was great.
No, I love it. And I hike, I do yoga, and I swim. And I should do much more. But anyway, that's what we do on this end. Now, I need to ask you what you think, some of your feedback about things, the trends in your research. What did you think about? Are you seeing an increase in more joyful, functional fitness for seniors? Are you seeing a growth in survivalist, sort of military fitness? Are you seeing less tech, more community? What are you seeing out there?
I think I see all of that. And you know what was very interesting? I do see all of that happening. And I think saw it even more starkly because of the pandemic, interestingly enough. Mm-hmm. Which I would never have expected. When the lockdown came, of course, gymnasiums all around the world closed. My two gyms, I belong to two gyms, closed. It was like, going cold turkey.
Yep.
And I had my little home exercise routine. But one thing I would do, aside from push-ups and ab workouts at home, was go for a walk every day. And what fascinated me so much was to see almost right away how people intuitively, instinctively wanted to gather in public spaces, socially distanced back in those days, to exercise outside. So we're talking to like late spring, summer 2020, the first year of the pandemic. And I live in New York City. I'd go down to Hudson River Park. And yes, sometimes it was group fitness classes led by an instructor, like a yoga instructor, everyone socially distanced. But even more interesting was that people would go to those grassy spaces or public spaces just to work out. And I think it emphasized or underscored for me how exercise does have this social aspect to it. There's a sense of community that does come together, sometimes inside of a gym, sometimes with your running group that runs outside. And then just naturally in the loneliness, frankly, and isolation of the lockdown, people like me all over New York City, getting out of their apartments, their little studio apartments, and wanting not even to exercise together, but be exercising in the same space as other people. It's inspiring.
Well, there's so much comes to mind when you say that. One is in 2019, when that study came out, the two researchers were with us in Singapore, and they looked at me, it's so hot there. And they were like, we're going to look for public dancing. We know it's here. We read it's here, and we're going to find it. And they came back all sweaty, and they were so happy they found some, like in a park, right?
Right.
But also, you make me think of the parks now are being overrun in New York by pickleballers, and everybody's mad.
I know. I do see that. That sort of came out of nowhere, it seemed to me.
I play, so let's support our pickleballers because it is so much fun. You can get good fast. That's why. You're like tennis, you're like, well, I should sit down. But in pickleball, you're like, I did that. It's so amazing. Okay. But it also reminds me of your book, How We Live Now, Scenes from the Pandemic. Was that a photo book or what was that?
I'm also a street photographer, and in the very beginning of the pandemic, I, just naturally was out taking photos, and New York it was like a different planet. It was emptied out, and I decided to put together a short book, which is on the first 100 days of the pandemic in New York.
Okay.
And the photographs are, 8th Avenue completely empty, as seen from my apartment, or subway stations or subway cars completely empty. Yeah. So seeing New York, seeing my city from a very different point of view, and writing about my own personal experience. So that book is pure memoir, and something closer to almost like a sequel to my book, Insomniac City, which is a memoir with photographs.
But when the city was alive.
Yeah, when the city was alive, right.
Yeah.
So Insomniac City is about my moving to New York at age 48, falling in love with New York, and falling in love with my late partner, Oliver Sacks, the neurologist and author. So it's kind of a love letter to New York and to Oliver.
Oh, you love that city. And I wish I would have met Oliver. But you remind me, too, we interviewed a friend of mine, Jennifer Walsh, who has a walking business. She leads CEOs and whatever and walks. Her last name is Walsh. So she calls it Walks with Walsh. And she did take lots of pictures. She's not an official street photographer like you. But that brings me to your book, Falling in Love with New York. It was photo essays. And what it was so cool about that I saw was it was just in the moment. When you turn your head, right?
Yeah. I wanted it to feel like you're just passing strangers in the streets of New York. I mean, one thing that's maybe different about my street photography from some street photography is that I always ask the person permission. May I take your photograph? So it's sort of like an on-the-spot portrait. They know they're having their picture taken, but it's a very quick encounter between two strangers. And I always felt like I wouldn't want people just taking my picture without my permission. So I always ask first. And there's something very magical that can happen in that brief encounter.
Well, I mean, who doesn't love New York if you really have an urban bone in your body? And so to catch it like that, we've all seen those moments, but to really have them crystallize is so cool. Now, speaking of your late partner, Oliver Sacks, I mean, just for the listener, he was a neuroscientist, quite accomplished researcher. His work was behind that Robin Williams award-winning movie, Awakenings. We got that name straight before we talked. But the thing that really struck me, because we're getting ready to go to Tel Aviv, there's a company that will be demonstrating their work called Mindstream, and it's all about how neuro-challenged people can be positively affected by music. But tell us about Oliver's work with music and healing.
Amazing. Well, first of all, music was a big part of his life from a young age. He came from a very musical family, the kind of family that would gather and have recitals and sing, and they all played piano very, very well.
Were they Mormon?
They were Jewish.
Okay.
Yes. And this was in London, and they had a grand piano in the house, and Oliver, like his three brothers, took piano lessons from a young age. So music was just always a part of his life. And then I think he just naturally, intuitively brought it into his practice as a neurologist.
Yeah.
And found early on, whether it was what are now called the Awakenings patients, the patients at Beth Abraham Hospital, made famous in the film Awakenings, or patients who suffered a stroke or a traumatic brain injury, or patients with dementia or Alzheimer's, how music could really play a role in helping restore memory. People who perhaps had a form of aphasia or dementia where they couldn't easily speak or even speak, who could then hear music and know the words to the song and sing along, and also experience the joy of music and the joy of moving to music. So someone who maybe had Parkinson's or had a stroke. So really bringing music into his neurological practice. I'm not saying he was the first to do that, but he made it a big part of his practice. and worked with music therapists who really were specialists.
Yep.
And then, of course, Oliver wrote a book, a famous best-selling book called Musicophilia, which was published in 2007. And it's filled with his case histories of using music in his practice and of unusual stories about how people adapt using music.
Yeah, we're just, today is World Mental Health Day, just whenever this posts, it won't be, but today's October 10th. And one of our, Mindstream is one of their artists does sleep music. It's called Liquid Mind. And I was so shocked to see, he doesn't brag about it, but it has as many downloads as Cardi B or Adele.
Wow.
Because people are seeking this. It is just, and he says the greatest compliment you can give him is to fall asleep to his music. Is that, that's so nice, right? Okay, well, there's so much we could talk about. I took so many notes, and I really, Bill, I so appreciate your hard work and how fun you made it and joyful. And one question I had is, how did you know when you really got to the source? Like if you go, this started in this century, how did you know there wasn't something else in another century? And when do you hit the wall?
Well, okay. There could be. It's one reason my book is subtitled A History of Exercise, not The History of Exercise.
Yeah.
Because there are histories of exercise yet untold, certainly more history of exercise in the East or in Africa or other parts of the world. One of the challenges for me was just, limiting the scope. I knew I could write an encyclopedia, but I really hope it inspires more histories of exercise. Though I do like the title Sweat. So I no one steals that.
But also, when you think of reading history, you're like, oh my God, yawn, I'm not that tight. But people have to know that it's not like that at all. It is really, it's a ride. And before we end, we really need to give a shout out to our wonderful Jane Fonda, don't we? Because she did a great job. Yeah,
we do. Yeah, my book comes up through the pandemic, but I really had to focus on the 70s and 80s when the fitness industry, as we know it today, the multi-billion-dollar fitness industry, really began exploding. And Jane Fonda was such an important figure during that time. I knew I would write about Jane Fonda. I grew up at that time. I remember when her videotapes came out and I went to aerobics classes. I remember that whole period. But I thought, I thought it might be campier, kitschier. But I took the time to read those early books and to watch those early videotapes. And I was so, so impressed. Mm-hmm. Those workout routines really hold up. She was a very gifted teacher. The way she led classes, the way she explained the exercises, and then in voiceovers explained which muscles are being utilized. I was so impressed. It's not just that, but she also just democratized exercise for women, especially, but not only women, all around the world. Women were doing Jane, as they said. And rather than having to buy a gym membership, they could just buy an inexpensive videotape, do it at home, not have to hire a babysitter. She brought exercise into people's homes. They could wear whatever they wanted. They could do it with friends. They could do it by themselves. Mm-hmm. And she was a damn good teacher. I mean, her exercise routines and workouts, and they were all different workouts, whether for pregnant women or postmenopausal women or there were so many different workout routines she worked out. So I say unequivocally that she was and is one of the most important figures in the history of exercise, male or female.
Oh, I remember. I've been around so long that I was there when Shape Magazine and IRSA, I think, the Fitness Association gave her an award. And, it's so good to hear what you're saying, because you often think, well, you do it because it's a celebrity and gives more clout to the topic. But she really put her money where her mouth was, right? And did it right.
She really did.
So that's so cool. All right. Well, as we wrap up, Bill, I would just like to know, our listeners, most of them are wellness curious. So to help them embrace this historical phenomenon that is exercise, what 3 tips might you give them? How could we make it easy? And I know the word that you're going to use, and I love this word, so I'll stand by.
Substitute the word movement for exercise. Just think of exercise as movement. Mm-hmm. It could be walking up and down the stairs of your apartment building. It could be walking from the subway. It could be swimming, but it could also be playing in the park with your dog or playing in the backyard with your kids. That's all exercise. It's all good. It should be joyful. I often hear from people who say they hate exercise. I often hear that phrase, I hate exercise, or they dread it, or they don't want to belong to a gym. And you don't have to. And there are so many different forms of movement. You can dance in your apartment for 10 minutes by yourself and your body will thank you. There's a great phrase from the great Russian scientist Pavlov, who talked about the sensation of muscular gladness.
Oh.
In other words, your body, your muscles feeling glad when you move them, when you use them. And I think you should think of movement and exercise as kind of a reward for your body, not just as something to dread, not just as a reason to sweat, but a reason to really enjoy life. The other thing I say to people is, while it's true that exercise has many health benefits and may extend your life, exercise for how it makes you feel now, right in the moment, how it makes you feel right in the moment. So when I swam that mile today, I wasn't thinking like, I'm 61 years old. I wasn't thinking like, this may extend my life by a couple of years. It was more that this feels so good. Mm-hmm. And it took me out of, the computerized digital world we live in, just swimming, being in my body, enjoying it in the moment. And also that, for me at least, the wonderful sensation of just trying to perfect a skill. Every time I swim, I feel like I learn something new and work on something new. And that can be true of yoga or running or walking or dancing, doing it with intention and doing it for how it makes you feel now.
That's so cool. I just love all those things. And I also love that we should just take a minute, and your book really makes us do that, and appreciate this fabulous body we've been given and embrace it and make it feel good. And it's okay to rest. Sometimes the best thing you could do is rest. Then earn that rest and get up and just move those limbs that are up here that can carry food while you run from a hyena. It's so really fun, right? Bill, thank you so much. We love your hard work. We benefit from it, and we look forward to keeping in touch. Okay?
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.